The most famous killer in human history had no face, no name that stuck, and no verdict for 137 years. And right now, as you are watching this, that might have just changed forever. Stay with me until the end of this video because I'm going to give you the name, the science, and the answer to the one question nobody ever asked out loud. If the police knew who he was, why did they let him walk free? And if you think you already know this story, I promise you, you do not. Because the answer is not the prince, not the surgeon, not the secret society. The answer is a 23-year-old barber from Poland, an ordinary man, a nobody. And that is what makes this so disturbing. Before this video is over, drop a comment. Do you think the science finally got him? Or do you think the real killer is still laughing at us from the fog? Let me know. I read every single one. Now let us go back. Autumn of 1888, London's East End, a district called Whitechapel. If you have never tried to picture this place properly, try now. More than 900,000 people jammed into just a few square miles. Poverty so dense that entire families slept in single rooms. Streets that twisted into alleys, that twisted into dead ends, that twisted into nothing. And over all of it, every single night, a thick yellow fog rolling in off the Thames, mixed with coal smoke from 10,000 chimneys, so heavy and so dark that you could hold your own hand in front of your face and barely see it. This was not a backdrop for a ghost story. This was a real place where real people were trying to survive. Women who had nothing, no safety, no savings, no one looking out for them, were out on those streets every night trying to earn a few pennies, just to pay for a bed in a doss house, a few pennies for a roof over their heads. That was all they needed, and someone was hunting them. Between August and November of 1888, at least 5 women were murdered in Whitechapel. Their names were Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. The killer did not simply kill them, he mutilated them, he removed internal organs, he worked with a speed and a cold precision that terrified not just London, but the entire world. And then he vanished, every single time, into the fog, into the dark, into nothing. Scotland Yard was drowning. They had no fingerprint technology, no forensic labs, no way to test a blood stain and learn anything useful from it. They had a whistle and a wooden truncheon and their own 2 eyes. Hundreds of letters poured in, thousands of tips, false confessions from people trying to get attention. Newspapers were selling copies faster than they ever had in history because the public was obsessed, and the police were no closer to an answer. So the legend took over. And what a legend it became. Because people could not accept that something this monstrous could come from something ordinary. Surely this man, they said, had to be extraordinary. A brilliant surgeon, a member of the royal family, a Freemason following some dark ritual. There was a theory, and people still whisper about it today, that Prince Albert Victor, the grandson of Queen Victoria herself, had secretly fathered a child with a poor Catholic woman in Whitechapel, and that a secret circle of Freemasons killed every woman who knew the secret to protect the monarchy. It had everything. A prince, a hidden baby, a secret brotherhood, ritual murders in the fog. People loved it. People still love it. And it was almost certainly pure fiction. But the fiction served a purpose. It made the killer feel worthy of the horror. It gave the horror a shape. Because if he was just some ordinary broken man from the worst streets in Britain, then there was no grand meaning to any of it. Just randomness. Just cruelty. And that was unbearable. So the mystery stayed locked. Decade after decade. Generation after generation. New books, new suspects, new authors swearing they had finally solved it. The doctor, the painter, the prince, the poet. And every time the phantom slipped away again, until a piece of cloth changed everything. In the year 2007, a man named Russell Edwards walked into an auction room and laid his eyes on a tattered length of silk. Old, faded, discolored, marked with brown stains that most people would have thrown in a bin without a second thought. But this piece of cloth came with a story attached to it. And that story said that this shawl had been at the scene on the night of September 30th, 1888, lying beside the body of Catherine Eddowes, the Ripper's 4th victim, in a dark square in Whitechapel called Mitre Square. According to the story passed down with the shawl, a police sergeant named Amos Simpson had been at the scene that night. And instead of logging the shawl as evidence, which he absolutely should have done, he took it home. Maybe he thought his wife would like the silk. Maybe he just pocketed a curiosity the way people did in an age before sealed evidence bags. Whatever his reason, the shawl never appeared in a single police report. It went home with a policeman, and it stayed in his family for over a century, folded in drawers, handled by relatives, half forgotten, never thrown out. Serious historians looked at this object and shrugged. In a case this famous, there was a whole industry of fake relics. Letters supposedly written by the killer, knives supposedly used in the murders. If anyone could attach a dramatic story to an object and sell it, plenty of people did. So the shawl sat in the reject pile for decades, dismissed as ripper junk, as wishful thinking dressed up in silk. But Edwards believed it was real. And he did something that nobody in 120 years of investigating this case had ever been able to do. He made the science catch up with the mystery. He found a researcher named Dr. Jari Louhelainen, based at Liverpool John Moores University, a specialist whose entire career was built around one specific and extraordinarily difficult problem. How do you recover genetic material from samples that are old, degraded, contaminated, and by every reasonable standard completely destroyed? If anyone could make a 125-year-old bloodstain speak, it was this man. And the odds were terrible. Consider what this Shawl had been through. A century and a quarter not sealed in a controlled vault, but stuffed in boxes, handled by generations of family members, exposed to damp English air, to dust, to sunlight, to the oils of dozens of human hands. Every one of those touches was an enemy. DNA is fragile. Time breaks it apart. Moisture destroys it. Handling smears and contaminates it. By any normal standard, getting a clean, readable genetic signal off this object was not just difficult. It was close to impossible. But Dr. Louhelainen knew exactly where to look. Not into the open fibers of the cloth, into the stains themselves. Because residue, real biological residue that is soaked deep into the threads of a fabric, can shelter and trap genetic material far longer than exposed cloth ever could. So the team worked with surgical patients, isolating tiny sections of the darkest stains, and they began the painstaking work of extraction. And here is where the science becomes something special. Because what they were hunting was not the standard DNA most people picture when they hear that word. The double helix inside a cell nucleus is powerful, but scarce and fragile. In a sample this old, most of it would be long gone. Instead, they went after something tougher and more abundant. Mitochondrial DNA. Here is why that matters. Every cell in your body contains tiny structures called mitochondria. Each of those mitochondria carries its own small separate loop of DNA. And there are hundreds, sometimes thousands, of these in a single cell. So even in a badly degraded sample where almost everything else has been destroyed, there is far more mitochondrial DNA to find. In a case this cold, that abundance is not just useful. It is the difference between finding a single grain of sand and finding 1,000 copies of it. But the truly remarkable thing about mitochondrial DNA, the thing that makes it almost like a time machine, is how it is inherited. Unlike the DNA in your cell nucleus, which is a shuffled mix from both your mother and your father, mitochondrial DNA comes from only one source. Your mother, and her mother before her, and her mother before that, back through an unbroken female line stretching across centuries. A man carries his mother's mitochondrial DNA, but he does not pass it on. Only women hand it down, which means the mitochondrial signature in your cells right now is essentially the same signature carried by your great-great-great-grandmother. A direct genetic echo, remarkably unchanged, down through the generations. That stability is exactly why forensic scientists reach for it when everything else has failed. It survives fire, rot, and time. It stays recognizably the same down a maternal line for so long that a sample from today can be placed beside a sample from the 1800s and genuinely compared. So the plan took shape. If they could pull mitochondrial DNA from the Shawl, they would need a living person to compare it against. Someone whose maternal line ran back unbroken to one of the people present at the scene on September 30th, 1888. And the first person they needed was not a suspect. It was a victim. Because before you can prove who committed a crime, you first have to prove the evidence was actually at the scene of it. Everything depended on this. If the Shawl was a fake, any DNA match would be meaningless. So they traced Catherine Eddowes' family tree, through dusty parish registers, through census records, through birth and marriage and death certificates faded with age. They followed the female line, mother to daughter, across 2 world wars, across a century of change, and eventually they found her. A living woman going about her ordinary modern life, entirely unaware that her blood carried a genetic fingerprint reaching all the way back to a murder victim from the age of gas lamps and horse-drawn carriages. Her name is Karen Miller, and she's a direct descendant of Catherine Eddowes. She gave a simple swab, a fraction of a second, and the team compared her mitochondrial DNA against what the laboratory had pulled from the bloodstains soaked deep into the Shawl. They matched. The first result showed a 99.2% match. Then they tested the second complementary strand of DNA, and that came back a perfect 100% match. Let that sit for a moment. The Shawl was not a fake. That tattered old piece of silk that historians had dismissed for a century as sentimental junk had been telling the truth all along. It had been there in that dark square. It had been soaked with the blood of a woman who was alive and breathing just minutes before. The object was real. But this was only the doorway. Because if the Shawl had truly been at the scene, soaked in Catherine Eddowes' blood, then it might carry more than her blood. It might carry something left by the man who spilled it. When the team looked more closely at the stains, they found something else. Mixed in among the traces of the victim, there was other biological material. The shawl contained traces of blood and semen, with the semen suspected to belong to the killer. The man who attacked Catherine Eddowes had left a piece of himself behind on the very fabric that lay against her body. If that were true, then the shawl was no longer just a relic of the victim. It was a carrier of the killer's own genetic signature, trapped in silk, sitting silent through the reigns of 6 monarchs, waiting for someone with the tools to finally read it. So they extracted the mitochondrial DNA from that second stain, and now they had a profile, not a name. Mitochondrial DNA cannot give you a name by itself, but it gives you a signature, a specific genetic sequence that can be compared against another person's DNA. What they needed now was a suspect, and not just any suspect pulled from 137 years of theory and guesswork, a man whose name was already there in the original police files, written down by the very officers who had been hunting the Ripper while the bodies were still warm. Because here is what most people never knew. While the public was chasing royal conspiracies and mad surgeons, the senior detectives of 1888, for all the limitations of their technology, were not fools. They had walked those streets. They had knocked on those doors. And privately, away from the newspapers and the panic, they had drawn up their own short list of the men they genuinely suspected. One name sat near the top of that list. Police reports from 1894 cited his great hatred of women, especially of the prostitute class, and his homicidal tendencies as reasons for suspicion. Chief Constable Melville McNacton wrote an internal memo naming this man as a leading suspect, describing him as dangerous and deeply mentally disturbed. And there is an even more astonishing piece of evidence. Chief Inspector Donald Swanson was the man who had personally overseen the entire Ripper investigation from beginning to end. Years after his retirement, he was reading through a copy of his old superior's published memoirs. And in the margin, beside the passage about the case, he scrawled a private note, a note never meant for anyone else's eyes. In that margin, in pencil, Swanson wrote that the killer was Kosminski, the man who had been sent to an asylum and died there. The officer who ran the hunt privately confirmed the name. It was hidden in a pencil scrawl in the margin of a book for decades. So the team found a living maternal descendant of this suspect, and they compared her DNA against the genetic profile pulled from the second stain on the shawl. It matched. Historian Russell Edwards claimed a 100% DNA match, identifying the killer as Aaron Kosminski, a Polish immigrant who came to Whitechapel in 1881 alongside his brother. If that name lands quietly rather than like a thunderclap, that is exactly the point. Aaron Kosminski does not fit the story the world spent 137 years telling itself. He was not a duke in disguise. He was not a genius anatomist. He was a 23-year-old Polish barber who lived and worked in Whitechapel at the time of the murders. He was local. He walked the same alleys as the victims. He breathed the same coal-thick air. He was not a phantom from the shadows. He was the man next door. His life before London had already been marked by suffering. He had fled Poland, then swallowed inside the Russian Empire to escape organized waves of violence against Jewish communities that drove entire families running for their lives. He arrived in London's East End looking for safety and found instead grinding poverty and a worsening mental illness. Medical reports from the time indicate that he exhibited symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia. He was said to be plagued by dark visions and voices no one else could hear. And the detail the old police files kept returning to, again and again, was a deep and violent hatred of women. The police had watched him. They had suspected him. They had written his name down in private memos. And there was one moment, according to historical accounts, where a witness who knew Kosminski was brought to identify him in person. The witness confirmed it was him, and then refused to give formal evidence. Without that testimony, the police had nothing they could take to court. He was released. He entered a workhouse in 1889, where he was described on admission as destitute. He was discharged and soon ended up in a mental asylum. And the moment Aaron Kosminski was taken off those streets, the murders stopped. No more bodies at dawn, no more mutilations. The terror that had paralyzed the East End simply ended, precisely when this one man was locked away. Kosminski died in an asylum in 1919. Now here is where the story in 2025 becomes something even bigger than a cold case solved, because the families of the victims are not willing to let this stay in a forensic journal or a true crime book. Karen Miller, the great-great-great-granddaughter of Catherine Eddowes, is backing a push for a new legal inquest. She gave her DNA to help make the match, and now she wants the name Aaron Kosminski legally confirmed in a court of law. The name Jack the Ripper has become sensationalized. It has gone down in history as this famous character. What about the real name of the person who did this? Having the real person legally named in a court would be a form of justice for the victims, she said. Russell Edwards and a high court barrister named Tim Sampson are pursuing this together, and the East London coroner has not opposed the application for a new inquest. This is no longer just a history argument. It is moving toward the legal system, toward official recognition. toward something that might finally allow the families of those 5 women to close a chapter that has been open for nearly a century and a half. But the critics are not silent, and their argument is serious. The core concern about contamination and the provenance of the shawl remains unresolved. That shawl passed through the hands of a policeman, his family, generations of relatives, collectors, an auction house, Russell Edwards himself, and then a modern laboratory. It was touched, folded, breathed on, and handled for over 130 years. How can anyone be certain with complete confidence that the DNA belongs to the killer and not to one of the dozens of people who held that silk across those 137 years? The scientific community has not reached a full consensus on whether the DNA analysis is conclusive enough to definitively identify the killer. That is the crack in the door that keeps this case from ever fully closing. The science is remarkable. The mitochondrial DNA work is real. The matches are documented and published in a peer-reviewed forensic journal. But the chain of custody for that shawl, the official record of where it has been and who has touched it, is broken. It was broken the moment Sergeant Simpson slipped it into his pocket and walked home instead of tagging it as evidence. So what are we left with? Here is what we know for certain. A silk shawl lay beside the body of Catherine Eddowes on the night of September 30th, 1888. DNA pulled from that shawl matches a living descendant of Eddowes herself, confirming the shawl was at the scene. A second DNA profile pulled from the same shawl matches a living maternal descendant of Aaron Kosminski, the man Scotland Yard's own senior officers privately believed was the Ripper. The murder stopped the moment Kosminski was committed to an asylum. He lived exactly where the killings happened. He was known to be mentally ill and violently hostile toward women, and the inspector who ran the investigation wrote his name down in a private margin note and carried that belief to his grave. Is that proof beyond all doubt? By the strict standard of a modern courtroom, not quite. The contamination question has not been fully answered, but is it the most compelling and scientifically grounded case anyone has ever made in 137 years of trying? Without question. And perhaps the most disturbing part of this entire story is not the identity itself. It is what the identity reveals about what was lost. The police knew. The senior detectives had his name. They had a witness who saw him and confirmed him. And they could not act because one frightened person refused to speak in public. So a dangerous, mentally ill man who hated women stayed on those streets. And 5 women paid for that failure with their lives. Karen Miller put it simply. We have got the proof. Now we need this inquest to legally name the killer. She is the great-great-great-granddaughter of a woman who was murdered in a dark square in 1888, and she has never had justice. Not one day of it. Not one official acknowledgement that the man who killed her ancestor has been found. The legend of Jack the Ripper was always built on the fog, on the idea that the killer was somehow beyond ordinary human reach, beyond ordinary human identity. A phantom, a ghost, a creature of the dark. But if the science is right, the truth is far more painful than any legend. He was not a phantom. He was a sick and broken young man living in poverty on the same streets as his victims. And the system that was supposed to protect those women let him slip through its fingers. 137 years. 5 women whose names deserve to be spoken louder than his title. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. 5 women who went out into the fog trying to survive another night and never came home. They deserve to have the man who did this named. Officially, legally, finally. Now I want to hear from you. Do you believe Aaron Kosminski was Jack the Ripper? Does the DNA evidence close this case for you? Or does the contamination problem leave enough doubt in your mind that the real killer might still be unknown? Tell me in the comments right now. And if you found this video worth your time, share it. Because the 5 women at the center of this story were forgotten for 137 years. The least we can do is make sure the world knows their names.